Good morning, students. We just spent a significant amount of time there talking about media, and I want to take a minute to say a few things about political participation before you finish up this quiz. I was looking at the schedule, and I know we have spring break right around the corner here, and what I'd like to do ideally is get our final Unit 5 test. It'll be a condensed version, 2 tests turned into one, which is going to cover linkage institutions, obviously, parties, interest groups, media, that's 3, and then we're going to normally have a test 2 on political participation and elections. What we're going to do is turn those 2 parts of Unit 5 into one final test, mostly for my sanity, because it's hard to teach an American government class without teaching about elections, about political participation, even if in brief. I know this will not be covered on your AP board exam this year, but nonetheless, we're going to wrap it up, and then post-spring break, we can spend all of our time reviewing, getting ready for that AP board test. So with that, political participation. Don't even worry about the reading guide here. With this part of this final quiz, simply use your Wilson textbook, refer to that, use each other. And these notes, of course, are designed specifically to help you with this part of the quiz on political participation. So what are we talking about? We're talking about us. How do we participate politically when we're talking in a general scheme of things, campaigns, elections, even policy making to some extent. And our focus, and the focus in Wilson, is on mostly voter behavior. Compared to Europe, we've talked about this, we tend to be, we show more efficacy. In other words, we think we can influence the system more so than most people in our European ally nations. We tend to, strangely, have more trust in government. We tend to participate in most things more. We participate more in religion. We participate more so in volunteerism. All that being said, ironically, our voter turnout is, when compared to, again, Democratic allies, horrible, which in English is horrible. We don't vote at a very good turnout. And that's always been an issue that's studied significantly in political science. Why do people vote? Why don't they vote? We break groups up by voter block, strong voter blocks, weak voter blocks. We'll get to that in just a minute. But one of the things that has come up in a lot of research is the way we do registration. There is no national registry. We do it state by state. And so every time you move, your precinct probably changes as well, which means you have to go through the voter registration process again. So most of the registration process, it falls on you. Now, we've tried to make it easier. We have these things called motor voter laws, which essentially means, let's say I need to get my license renewed, so I take my driver's license in to get renewed, and lo and behold, on the counter at the Secretary of State's office are voter registration forms. And it takes me 2 minutes to fill one out. I can turn it in, and boom, I'm registered. And we've done a number of things in this country to make it easier for people to register or re-register when you move locations. Now, we are a very mobile society, so obviously a lot of people who move around are not necessarily registered for elections, or I don't want to say too lazy to register, but we're busy. And it's not always easy to register to vote. Again, we're making that easier. But compare this to a country where you are just registered. You're in a national registry. Everybody knows you're there. You can move 50 times within a month, and nothing's changed. You're registered to vote. And so that inconvenience is probably one of the reasons that our voter turnout is so low. Now, there may be other reasons, but that's the main one that I want to get into. Now, another unique thing about participation in voting is that it does, in this country, it comes down to not just state, but even county, and then even precinct. And so you're going to find different ballots throughout the state of Michigan for the same election. You're going to find different quote-unquote technology, machines that are used to register your vote, to make sure that your vote counts. The machines vary widely, oftentimes depending on how wealthy or how poor a county is. What can they afford? Now, the federal government has at times offered money to help states catch up with better equipment. For a while, we're looking at, because technology is everything, we were looking at machines that were paperless. Can you say nightmare? Folks, that is a nightmare. You don't want paperless when it comes to elections. Any sort of fraud, you'd never be able to figure out if you didn't have a paper trail to go back and count. And we've learned historically that, okay, paper is a good idea in this case. And so we went into the high-tech super briefly, and now we're kind of rearing back, still using high-tech voting machines, but you have a paper ballot. You should always have a paper ballot that you can go back to and say, hey, let's just make sure. And you can have counters go back through an election that might be challenged. No paper ballot, estupido. States that are not using it, counties that are using paperless voting machines, stupid. And just you're leaving the door wide open to fraud and abuse. Now, at the same time, having all of these different contraptions, all of these different ballots, there's some benefit to that. It's a lot more difficult for hackers, for Russia, thanks Putin, to mess with our elections. We know that in the last election, they did try to interfere in particular state elections. Well, the beauty of having 50 different states doing 50 different things is that it's much harder for hackers to mess with a national election. Even if they were to play around in, say, Indiana, it's unlikely that that would affect the nationwide vote in a major election like a presidential election. Could it? Sure, but it's a lot more difficult than if we just had a gigantic national popular vote. The only database that a hacker would have to get into is one. This crazy system we have, this chaotic, various way to deal with elections is actually, for that reason, beneficial in the modern era. Now, strong voter groups versus weak voter groups. Folks, the well-educated vote at a higher rate than those that are not. Socioeconomics. Higher the income, more likely to vote. Lower income, not necessarily. When you compare blue-collar worker, like somebody who works at a factory, versus white-collar worker, somebody who's in a profession like a doctor or a lawyer, you tend to have the white-collar workers voting at a higher rate than the blue-collar workers. Those are what we refer to as voter blocks. Now, one of the worst historically, over the course of time, 18 to 25-year-olds are very poor at voting. They don't show up, and oftentimes that's because of college and maybe other things going on in your lives, like you have lives. Strong voter group, I would argue 45 and over, even better, 55 and older. Again, don't really have lives anymore. Time on their hands, have learned from life experience that voting might actually matter. And for a variety of reasons, older folks, more time, retired, etc., they're going to show up at the polls. They're exciting. You have other things that are exciting. TikTok. I got to get into TikTok. Now, what are some of the major changes in this country over time? When it comes to enfranchisement, enfranchisement means the ability to vote. The 12th Amendment slightly revised the Electoral College to make it a little bit more modern and sensible. It tied the president and the VP together as a team, as opposed to having our electors choose a first place president and then a second place president. And then even if those two hated each other's guts, whoever got first and then whoever got second were the president and the VP. The 12th Amendment said, no, this probably isn't a good idea. Let's have a separate vote for pres and then a separate vote for who should be vice president. And of course, today we have the team concept. 15th Amendment, the right to vote for African Americans, and specifically at this time in history, it would be African American males, because women were not yet allowed to vote. That would come with the, you got it, 19th Amendment. We've studied that one. 23rd Amendment gave the District of Columbia 3 electoral college votes, because they do have humans there that vote. They're U.S. citizens, and although they're not a state, they're so enveloped in the states that we gave them the same amount of electoral votes as the smallest states in the Union. So they can never have more than 3, even though arguably by population they deserve more than 3. But that's the 23rd Amendment. 24th Amendment got rid of the poll tax. 26th Amendment gave the right to vote to 18 to 21-year-olds, expanding that enfranchisement power. Things that were eliminated over time, the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was enormously important. Number one, it got the federal government involved in the election process. They can monitor the polls to make sure that states are following rules. You've got elimination of the literacy tests. You have elimination of other things. The grandfather clauses and the white primaries of the Deep South no longer, thanks to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Crucial piece of legislation for enfranchisement. One other thing we talk about, apathy. People don't care. People don't show up at the polls for a variety of reasons. And you can look on that negatively, but what I want to point to is something a little bit more unusual, and that is maybe apathy is a positive thing. And the question would be, why would Madison prefer that not everybody vote? And I think you guys know the answer. Madison was not always trusting of your average citizen. He wanted people to vote who maybe had a little bit more knowledge of the system, of politics. And that's one of the reasons we have an electoral college in the first place. We didn't want to leave that job of electing a president up to citizens that might be too ignorant to figure it out. And so is apathy necessarily bad? Yeah, it depends on how you're looking at it. When the apathetic aren't voting, you're leaving the decision, I guess, up to those that are more political elite, more politically involved, more political activists. That's good. Now, I'm in the camp of, hey, the more people who vote, the better. That wider perspective of what this country is made of, I want to hear from everybody, even those that maybe are not as up and into politics as others. But I totally understand the Madison concept as well. Now, on that concept of political activists, that comes up in our chapter on political participation. A political activist or a political elite versus the inactive. Slight distinction there. A politically active person is somebody involved in politics. You can become a political activist if you're simply involved. If you're voting, if you're participating in elections, you're keeping up on news, you're a political activist. The inactive just don't get into it at all. Now, is there a difference between the political elite and the political activist? I would argue not a whole lot, because they're both deeply involved. What a political elite might have that the activist does not. For example, let's call me a political activist. A political elite might be somebody like Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates has, I want to say, probably $5,000 or $6,000 more than I do. And so that gives him a little bit more clout because he probably has connections that I don't have. He can donate to campaigns like I can't. He can probably produce his own commercials if he wants to. That makes him a little more powerful than me. So maybe if you're going to find a difference between a political activist and a political elite, it probably relates to money, connections, position, something like that. But if you want to be involved in politics and make a difference in politics, any person in this country can do that. So that's a quick summary of political participation. I hope that helps you with your quiz. Anything else you might need for the quiz, go to Wilson. I forget the chapter, but political participation. One chapter in Wilson on political participation. That's where you want to go. Good luck.